The third person I want to introduce is the media and story creator, Rebeka Tabobondung. Her talk is entitled Towards an Indigenous Internationalism Across the Americas, reflecting on the third encounter. Rebeka is the founder and editor-in-chief of muskratmagazine.com, a leading online Indigenous arts and culture magazine established in 2010. The magazine strives to honor, investigate, and disseminate traditional knowledges in ways that inspire their reclamation. Rebeka has traveled extensively throughout Central America, working to build meaningful links between Indigenous communities in the North and the South. She's a member of the Wasauksing First Nations. She is a filmmaker, writer, poet, and Indigenous knowledge and oral history researcher. She is a research associate with the Well Living House and Indigenous Action Research Center in Toronto, specializing in community-based research.
Thank you.
You want to use the mic?
Oh, use the mic, okay. Hello. Ooh, okay. Rebeka Tabobondung, Indigenous, Wasauksing, Donjiba, Amik, Dodem. My name is Rebeka Tabobondung. I'm from Wasauksing First Nation, which is near Parry Sound, about 3 hours north of Toronto. And I'm Beaver Clan. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional territories of this land, which are the Anishinaabe and shared territories of the Haudenosaunee as well. I believe, well, Six Nations is not far from here. We have a long history of many Indigenous nations occupying these territories for tens of thousands of years. For me, just introducing myself in that language, would like to start by just saying a little bit of background about myself. And this presentation, it's a reflection about the vision for the third encounter for humanity against imperialist globalization, a global caucus of the people, which was work that was done in the early 2000s in the city of Toronto. And it was spearheaded by an Indigenous scholar, visionary, and activist who's now passed on. His name was Rodney Bobby Wash. Now I'm just curious in this room, who was involved in, who knew Rodney first of all? Okay, some people sort of knew him, okay, and then who might have heard or is familiar with the encounters that took place across some places within the Americas, so bringing Indigenous people together. Okay, so that's cool. I was just curious about the room. So I wanted to just give a little bit of a background about myself, and I know there's not a lot of time, so I'll be skipping through. So that statement that I said, it took me 40 years to learn that. Who I am, my clan, where I come from, and to say it within my own Indigenous language. I grew up in 14 different towns and cities throughout Canada. And if that didn't give me an identity crisis enough, my mother's birthplace in Holland surely did. So for me, by the tender age of 19, I had an amazing opportunity to, through a BC-based NGO called Co-Development Canada. People know, okay, yes, who, what they were doing was linking like-minded organizations and groups in the North and the South together, such as teachers, trade unionists, teachers unions, and Indigenous youth. And so I had an opportunity to go on an exchange with Mayan Indigenous youth in Guatemala and Indigenous youth in Canada. And the experience shocked me and changed my life forever. Because I just learned so much. I knew so little. Of course, about the 36-year Civil War that took place in Guatemala, where Indigenous people, who are the majority of the country but own less than 5% of the land. And at that time, I listened to many extreme stories of persecution. Of course, the peace accords had been signed the year before I arrived, I believe in '96, and they were stories about persecution by the army, the paramilitaries, And at the heart of the onslaught was to remove Indigenous peoples from their lands in order to exploit its resources for profit. I heard stories, disturbing stories of women and children and families being hunted down, attacked, chopped up through scorched earth policies. Stories of mothers who accidentally killed their babies while trying to keep their mouths shut so they wouldn't cry while they hid in the mountains. Stories about decapitations, heads left to rot as warnings in the town square. And we had with us pencils and papers that in which we took notes and listened to these stories, and I wondered what the heck we were going to do with these notes. So I traveled, I became very close to friends and Indigenous friends, brothers and sisters there, and I traveled back. What left me was the understanding and being struck by the lack of education of the Indigenous youth there, the pervasive power of the Christian missionaries. Many of my friends did not know that the sun existed at the center of the universe, which was a far cry from their traditional ancestral knowledge. So I recognized the power of education, the media, and as I had no idea that these atrocities had even taken place while I studied in the final year of high school. But for me, probably the hardest part was coming home to Canada and to learn about our Indigenous history here and the history of my own culture. And there was a tidal wave of sadness as Indigenous elders, learning about, from Indigenous elders, painting the picture of cultural genocide, forced assimilation, broken treaties and land theft here. So I kept traveling periodically to the south, went to Chiapas and volunteered, learned about the Zapatistas and how effectively they used media to get their message out. I went back with a video camera to Guatemala and documented many more stories, and became an activist involved in the student union at Langara College where I was attending school. And I became very passionate about media, documenting our stories in an effort to show that to protect Indigenous struggle and to document that these atrocities had in fact taken place and to seek support and educate people about that. And I produced and directed a documentary called The Original Summit, Journey to the Sacred Uprising, which was based on the FTA Summit in Quebec 2001. And I really wanted to show that Quebec City is on Indigenous land, that there is a larger story of colonialism that's not included within many of these anti-globalization movements that were so-called progressive. And so that documentary explored that and how Chief Donnacona was actually kidnapped and murdered and had his two sons murdered by Jacques Cartier, and the theft of the lands there. And I got to interview Rodney Bobbywash, who was also involved in this work, and meet Rodney. And Rodney was also a friend to Kimi Pernio Domingo, who is of the Imbaracachio Nation in Colombia, and who also presented at the FTAA Summit in Quebec City in 2001. And sadly, very shortly thereafter, he was murdered and disappeared. So Rodney, this is an image, a painting that's not done. He was a knowledge keeper, a warrior, an activist, and a visionary. And he was the founder of the Toronto Native History Project. It's still active today, and it now goes by the name of First Story Toronto. You can download their app. They have an app that maps out Indigenous history of Toronto. He unfortunately passed away in January 2012 at the age of 42. And when he died, over 700 people, friends, relatives, co-workers, attended his funeral, his service at the Native Canadian Centre. He was so I was looking back on some of what's out there on the internet. This was written by Kevin Thomas. There are excerpts of an article that was published in Now magazine. So he was a scholar, an anti-racist activist, an advocate for Indigenous people around the globe. He left, leaving a void that may never be filled. And it was no accident that he touched so many lives. By his awesome roster of achievements, he was the founder of Clanbusters, professor of Aboriginal Studies, executive director of the Native Canadian Centre, defender of Columbia's and Barocaccio people. He was the organizer for the Third Encounter for Humanity, director of the Forum for Global Exchange, and so much more. And he was one of those rare personalities who coupled serious dedication with an immense sense of humor and a penchant for mischief. No one who knew him could forget him. He was born of the Bear Clan in the Mississauga Nation, educated at Trent University in Oxford. He had a tremendous range of constituencies. And he had extraordinary presence, and I can attest to that. He was a mentor and a friend to me, and I miss him dearly, and that void has indeed not ever been filled. And I'm sure many people who knew him miss him immensely as well. So Rodney's vision was to bring the encounter, which were gatherings that came out of the Zapatista First Intercontinental Encounter for Humanity Against Neoliberalism, which was in July of 1996. And it was to look at how movements could come together and address what's wrong with modern capitalism, and how we can acknowledge the mistakes of the past and previous anti-capitalist movements, how they failed, and how we could avoid these mistakes in the future. From that first encounter, I'll read an excerpt of the declaration that was made by the Zapatista Army of National Liberation. Brothers and sisters, during this last year, the power of money has presented a new mask over its criminal face, disregarding borders, with no importance given to races or colors. The power of money humiliates dignities, insults honesties, and assassinates hopes. Renamed as neoliberalism, the historic crime in the concentration of privileges, wealth, and impunities democratizes misery and hopelessness. The new distribution of the world excludes minorities, the indigenous youth, women, homosexuals, lesbians, people of color, immigrants, workers, peasants. The majority who make up the world's basements are presented, for power is disposable. The new distribution of the world exists to exclude the majorities. In the year before Rodney's death, he worked for the Center for the World Indigenous Studies. Okay, so I only have 3 minutes left. And this picture here is being painted right now by the Métis artist Tanis Nielsen. It's at Simcoe, Lower Simcoe and Front Street, which will be a series of portraits for elders and water walkers. And Rodney, of course, was not an elder or a water walker. He was only 42, but it speaks to the significance and impact that he had. Experience and knowledge into the global justice movement and summits. And he believed, as I do, that the lack of including Indigenous knowledge and experiences has extreme consequences for all of us. And he spoke to practicing our spirituality to protecting the biodiversity of our traditional territories, and basically to just be Indigenous, for people to just be, is at the heart of our struggle to fight against the hegemonic power of imperialist globalization, and that the heart of the struggle must be in community. And he talked about, when I reflect on that, about yes, the heart of the struggle is in community, and it's also in relationship, and that's what he was trying to do, is to build relationships in a meaningful way, to invite non-Indigenous sectors and struggles to build relationships with Indigenous people, and in that learn how to build relationships with the world that we live and are part of, the natural world, and our relationship to the natural world. And it was really important for him to acknowledge the genocide that has taken place in the Americas, and that without doing that, there could be no advancing and moving forward. And thinking about that and what that means today in Canada, I see reconciliation, the impact of the TRC, and this consciousness shift that is happening in Canada, where people are acknowledging for the first time Indigenous history. But we have so much farther to go. And it's not just about understanding the atrocities that happened and their impacts, but reconstructing something new. And at the heart of that is to what Rodney spoke about, and the encounter was throwing out the racist doctrines of discovery, which we still must do in this country and in the world, to reconceive of new systems, new relationships of working together. Because as Rodney pointed out, and many people do, is we're all in this together. We've all been impacted by colonization. We all have been deeply wounded. And at this time, we are at the end of this project of colonization. Rodney said it wasn't something new. Imperialist neoliberalism was not something new. It was just the final phase of the final project of colonization that began well over 500 years ago. So there is, I know I should wrap up. We are in a state, as we know, of global warming. That's the last great plunder that's happening. And we need to dismantle our structures, decolonize our thinking, embrace other world views, and listen to Indigenous people who offer solutions. I now publish a magazine called Muskrat Magazine. We're an online Indigenous arts and culture magazine. And I also organize the Gitche Daywin Festival, which is a arts and culture festival that, and storytelling festival that shares traditional stories and works to invite people to come together and share in knowledge and build relationships. So I invite people to please take a card and feel free to contact me afterwards. This is our unity pin, which I'm sure people know about, which is the 4 sacred colors and the directions, and then also I don't know more. And I want to thank the organizers who invited me here today, because it's been a while since I've been in these circles, and it's great to reflect on it, and hopefully I can take these reflections and produce something more formal to acknowledge this important history. Thank you.